Nobody filmed Thomas Aldridge that morning. Every single camera in that yard, and there were dozens of them, was pointed somewhere else. Press photographers had their lenses locked on the horses. Tourists were jostling for position near the gate, phones raised, trying to catch the moment the mounted guards rode out in full ceremonial dress. A small group near the far wall was so focused on getting Sergeant David Holt's bearskin cap and frame that they had been standing in the same spot for 40 minutes without moving. Nobody was watching the quiet man in the worn leather apron, standing near the tack room door. But here is what nobody in that yard understood yet. The parade they had all woken up early for, the state ride they had traveled in some cases thousands of miles to witness, the ceremonial procession that had been planned for months and involved coordination between royal households, diplomatic staff, and security teams across 2 countries. All of it, every single polished second of it, was about to depend entirely on Thomas Aldridge and the tools in his canvas bag. And he had 8 minutes. Now, before we get into what happened in those 8 minutes, and believe me, every second of it matters, we need to understand what a state ride actually is. Because if you have only ever seen one from the pavement, waving a small flag as the horses go past, you have seen perhaps 5% of the story. The other 95% happens behind walls and gates and stable doors that the public never sees, and it is far more extraordinary than the polished version that comes out the other side. A state ride is not a parade in the casual sense of the word. It is not a procession organized for public entertainment, though the public certainly benefits from witnessing it. A state ride is a formal ceremonial escort, typically accompanying a visiting head of state or a member of the royal family between significant locations, and it carries with it the full symbolic weight of the British monarchy. Every horse is selected months in advance. Every rider is trained for years before they are considered ready for a state occasion. The route is walked, measured, and assessed. The timing is not approximate. It is exact, coordinated down to the minute with police outriders, palace staff, and in many cases the schedules of foreign dignitaries whose own motorcades are timed to meet the procession at a specific point. When something goes wrong in the public part of a state ride, the world notices immediately. Cameras catch it, headlines form within minutes, and the image of British ceremonial precision takes a hit that the palace communications team spends days managing. But the thing that most people do not realize is that the closer you get to the actual departure point, the less room there is for anything to go wrong at all. By the time those horses walk out of the Royal Mews gate and onto the street, every variable should already have been controlled, checked, double-checked, and confirmed. Every variable, except the ones that do not announce themselves in advance. A loose horseshoe is one of those variables. Now let's talk about what a loose horseshoe actually means on a working ceremonial horse, because the instinct is to minimize it. It sounds like a minor mechanical issue, the kind of thing you fix in an afternoon without any particular stress. And on a regular horse on a regular day with no particular schedule to meet, that instinct would be largely correct. You call the farrier comes, the shoe gets pulled and replaced or reset, the horse rests, everyone goes home for tea. But on a ceremonial horse, on a state occasion morning, with 40 minutes until a diplomatically significant procession is scheduled to leave the yard, a loose horseshoe is not a minor mechanical issue. It is a potential cascade of problems that can unravel an entire operation if the right person does not respond in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. Here is why. A horse carrying a loose shoe does not move normally. The shoe shifts slightly with each step, creating an uneven pressure distribution across the hoof that changes the horse's gait in ways that are subtle but visible to anyone who knows what they are looking at. On a ceremonial ride, the horses move in formation, and any irregularity in one horse's movement affects the rhythm and visual symmetry of the entire group. Beyond the aesthetic problem, there is a genuine welfare and safety concern. A shoe that is loose enough to shift can catch on uneven pavement, twist, and cause the horse to stumble. On a public road surrounded by crowds, with a rider in full ceremonial dress who needs both hands for control and composure, a stumble is not just an embarrassment. It is a serious safety incident. So when Sergeant David Holt noticed that Centurion was shifting his weight differently that morning, he did not dismiss it. David Holt had been riding with the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment for 11 years at that point. He had done 6 state occasions, 2 royal funerals, and more routine mounted duties than he could count. He knew what a horse moving normally felt like, and he knew what a horse moving with a problem felt like. And Centurion, one of the most reliable black horses in the regiment's current string, was not moving normally. He dismounted quietly. This is the moment the tourists first noticed something was happening, and this is also the moment the tourists first got it completely wrong. When a mounted guard in full ceremonial kit dismounts unexpectedly in the staging yard, it is not a common sight. The whole choreography of a state departure is built around mounted soldiers staying mounted, moving in formation, presenting the image of effortless readiness. An unexpected dismount, especially from a senior sergeant, reads to the uninitiated eye as something serious, something wrong, something potentially parade-ending. Within about 30 seconds of David Holt swinging down from Centurion's back, a ripple went through the tourist group near the gate. You could see it move through them like a wave. The woman in the yellow jacket grabbed her husband's arm. The man with the enormous camera lens lowered it slightly and squinted. 3 people who had been facing the other direction turned around because they felt the energy shift even without seeing what caused it. And then the whispers started. "Is the horse hurt?" Someone said it too loudly, and several people turned to look at them. "Is the parade canceled?" This one spread faster, passed from person to person in at least 3 different languages within the space of about a minute. One of the press photographers, a young man who had clearly been sent to cover the departure and was worried about missing the shot, started typing something on his phone with an expression of barely controlled panic. None of them were right, not even close. What David Holt had found. Crouching at Centurion's rear left leg with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been checking horses for over a decade, was a shoe that had worked loose at the heel. Not catastrophically loose. Not shoe about to fall off loose, but loose enough, and more importantly loose in a way that would get worse, not better, over the course of a procession through London streets. The nail had simply worked its way out over the past few days, a thing that happens even to the most carefully maintained horses, an inevitability of metal on hoof on hard ground over time. It was not negligence. It was not a failure of the yard's maintenance routine. It was just a thing that happens, and it had chosen this particular morning to happen, 40 minutes before departure. David Holt stood up and walked to the yard supervisor without any visible urgency in his step. This is worth noting. He did not run. He did not make a face that communicated alarm. He moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who has identified a problem and is now moving toward the solution, and his composure in that moment was itself a form of professionalism. Panic in a yard full of horses is counterproductive in the most literal sense. Horses read human emotional states with extraordinary sensitivity, and a sergeant moving through the yard with visible anxiety on his face would have communicated that anxiety to every horse in the space within minutes. He reached the yard supervisor, spoke quietly for about 10 seconds, and the yard supervisor reached for his radio. Thomas Aldridge was in the tack room when the call came. Now here is something important to understand about Thomas Aldridge and about farriers who work at the Royal Mews in general. Thomas had been the farrier assigned to the Household Cavalry's ceremonial string for 6 years at this point. Before that, he had spent 4 years working with racehorses in Newmarket, and before that he had completed a 3-year apprenticeship that began when he was 16 years old. By the morning of this state departure, Thomas Aldridge had been working with horses and horseshoes for the better part of 2 decades. He had reshod horses in the rain, in the dark, in stables that smelled like everything you would expect a stable to smell like after a long night. He had dealt with horses who cooperated and horses who very much did not. He had worked fast when fast was needed, and worked carefully when careful was needed, and he had developed over all of those years the ability to assess a situation in the first 30 seconds and know immediately which of those modes the moment required. He heard the call, picked up his canvas tool bag, which was already packed because at the Royal Mews on a state occasion morning, your tools are always packed, and walked out of the tack room. 41 minutes to departure. He had been called at 40 minutes and had spent approximately 1 minute gathering himself and walking to the yard. So now it was 39 minutes. In terms of raw time, that sounds like plenty. But a horseshoe reset is not simply a matter of hammering a nail back in. If the nail has worked loose, the hole it occupied in the hoof wall may be compromised, which means Thomas would need to assess whether the existing hole could be reused or whether a new site needed to be selected. He would need to check the condition of the shoe itself, ensure it had not bent or twisted out of its correct shape during the period of looseness. He would need to clean the hoof surface, reset the shoe to the correct position, and nail it with the precise angle and depth that keeps the shoe secure without putting pressure on sensitive internal structures. And he would need to do all of this with Centurion standing quietly, on a morning when the yard was full of people and energy, and the particular restless electricity that state occasion mornings carry even for horses who have done this many times before. He knelt at Centurion's rear, left leg, and began. The tourists watched in almost complete silence for about 45 seconds before the misreading started again. The woman in the yellow jacket, who had by now appointed herself the unofficial commentator for her immediate group, said in a carrying whisper that she thought the horse's leg looked swollen. It did not look swollen. What she was seeing was Thomas's hand running firmly along the lower leg in the standard pre-work assessment that every farrier does before touching a hoof, feeling for heat or irregularity that might change the approach. But it looked, to someone who had never seen a farrier work, like someone checking for an injury, and the swollen leg theory spread through the group with remarkable speed for a theory with no factual basis whatsoever. The press photographer had apparently decided the parade was definitely canceled because he was now on a phone call, speaking in a hushed but intense voice to what sounded like a picture editor who was not pleased with the update. A small child near the front of the tourist group pointed at Thomas and said, loudly and with great confidence, that the man was pulling the horse's leg off. Her mother looked mortified. 3 adults nearby turned to look with expressions of alarm before registering that this was not in fact what was happening. Thomas did not look up. This is the detail that stays with you when you think about this moment afterward. Through all of it, the whispering, the wrong theories, the press photographer's quiet crisis, the child's dramatic narration of events, Thomas Aldridge did not look up from his work once. Not because he was unaware of the audience. He was completely aware. You do not spend 6 years working in a public-facing royal facility without developing a permanent background awareness of being observed. He simply did not allow the observation to enter his working mind. The audience existed somewhere outside the circle of his concentration, present but irrelevant, like weather. He pulled the loose nail cleanly, checked the hole, made a decision in about 4 seconds the hole was usable, the wall was sound, checked the shoe's shape against the hoof profile with a practiced eye, found it still true, cleaned the hoof surface, repositioned the shoe. Centurion stood like a statue. This also deserves attention. Centurion was a 9-year-old black gelding who had been with the mounted regiment for 5 years. He was experienced, well-trained, and by all accounts a horse with the particular kind of settled temperament that ceremonial work selects for and develops. But he was still a horse, on a busy morning, with a strange man crouching at his leg doing something that involved metal tools and firm pressure and the occasional sound of a hammer. The fact that he stood quietly, weight balanced, ears relaxed, was not an accident of luck. It was the result of years of handling by people who understood him, and of the specific trust that builds between a horse and the professionals who care for him regularly. Thomas was not a stranger to Centurion. He was one of the most familiar humans in that horse's daily life, and Centurion's stillness was in some sense a form of trust made visible. The new nail went in at an angle that Thomas had used thousands of times, guided by a muscle memory so deep it had long since stopped requiring conscious thought. The clinching, the process of bending the nail end over to lock it against the hoof wall, was done with 3 precise strikes that sounded, in the relative quiet of the yard, almost like a small, businesslike applause. 31 minutes to departure. Thomas stood up, ran his hand along the shoe one final time, straightened, and stepped back. He looked at David Holt. David Holt looked at the shoe, looked at the leg, looked at Thomas, and gave a single nod that contained within it approximately 11 years of experience, confirming that what he was seeing was correct. That was the entire exchange. No words, just a nod. The tourist group, which had been holding a collective breath for reasons they did not entirely understand, exhaled. The woman in the yellow jacket said to her husband that she thought everything was probably fine now, and her husband, who had been quietly certain everything was fine for the past 8 minutes, agreed diplomatically. The press photographer ended his phone call, looked at Centurion standing solid and calm, looked at the yard operating normally around him, and had the expression of a man revising his understanding of what had just happened and feeling slightly embarrassed about the phone call he had just made. The child near the front looked at her mother and said the man had put the leg back on and the leg looked good. Her mother chose not to correct the terminology. 28 minutes to departure, the yard moved into its final preparation rhythm. This is the phase of a state occasion morning that looks, from the outside, almost choreographed, and that is because in a very real sense it is. Final tack checks, final uniform inspections, the particular kind of focused quiet that settles over working professionals in the last half hour before something important begins. Horses were walked in slow circles to keep their muscles warm and their minds settled. Riders made the small adjustments to their own bearing and posture that shift them from standing still to being ready. The energy in the yard changed quality, became more concentrated, pointed forward. Thomas Aldridge packed his tools back into his canvas bag. He checked the yard around him briefly, registered that the departure preparation was proceeding normally, and walked back toward the tack room. A young stable hand near the door said something to him as he passed, and he answered with a few words and a slight shrug that seemed to mean something like it was just a nail, not a big thing, which was in one sense completely accurate and in another sense an almost spectacular understatement. Nobody in the tourist group watched him go. They were all looking at the horses again. At exactly the scheduled minute, the gates opened. Centurion walked out of the Royal Mews yard as part of the formation, his gait even, his head up, his rear left shoe holding with the same security as the other 3. The sound of hooves on the courtyard stones had the precise, satisfying rhythm that people travel long distances to hear. The tourists near the gate pressed forward. Phones went up. The press photographer found his shot, and the expression of mild professional crisis left his face entirely and was replaced by the focused calm of someone doing their job well. The procession moved out into the street. The crowd on the pavement, who had been waiting for an hour in some cases, who had their own flags and their own cameras and their own reasons for being there on that particular morning, saw what they had come to see. Mounted soldiers in ceremonial dress, moving in perfect formation, horses in step, the whole ancient and polished machinery of royal tradition operating exactly as it was supposed to operate. None of them knew about the 8 minutes in the yard. None of them knew about Thomas Aldridge or the canvas bag or the 3 strikes of the hammer that had, in a completely unspectacular and entirely essential way, made the moment they were witnessing possible. And here is where this story stops being about a horseshoe. Because what happened in that yard on that state occasion morning is a version of something that happens in almost every significant public moment that looks effortless from the outside. The effortlessness is the product of invisible work. The seamlessness is held together by people whose names are not on the program, whose faces do not appear in the photographs, and whose expertise is most perfectly demonstrated by the fact that when they do their job correctly, there is no visible sign that anything required doing at all. Think about what it actually takes to produce a moment of ceremonial precision. Not the visible part, the uniforms, the horses, the choreographed movement, but the invisible architecture beneath it. The stable staff who have been awake since before dawn. The veterinary checks done quietly before any tourist arrived. The tack room where equipment is inspected with a thoroughness that the public would find almost obsessive if they ever saw it. The years of training that allow a rider to sit perfectly still on a horse that weighs half a ton in front of crowds making unpredictable noise. And the farrier, who carries everything he needs in a canvas bag, and who can fix in 8 minutes something that would end the morning if it were left unaddressed, and who does it with no drama, no announcement, and no particular expectation that anyone will notice. This is not a uniquely royal or military phenomenon. It is a pattern that exists wherever excellence is on display. Behind every performance that looks natural, there are people who made it natural through effort that is specifically designed to be invisible. The surgeon whose movements look unhurried because her training has made hurry unnecessary. The engineer whose bridge stands so solidly that nobody thinks about the bridge at all. The editor whose work is invisible precisely because it is good. The farrier whose 8 minutes of work disappear into the larger perfection of a procession that moves, as far as the crowd is concerned, as if nothing could ever go wrong. Thomas Aldridge's contribution to that morning existed in negative space. You could not point to it in any of the photographs taken that day. It was not in the footage. There was no moment in the procession where Centurion stumbled, because Centurion did not stumble, and the reason Centurion did not stumble was standing in the tack room cleaning a hammer while the parade went by outside. And perhaps this is the thing worth sitting with. We are very good, as an audience, at celebrating the visible. The rider in the uniform gets the photograph. The horse with the perfect bearing gets the admiring comment. The procession as a whole gets the crowd and the flags and the feeling of occasion that people carry home with them and talk about for years. All of that celebration is genuine, and none of it is misplaced. These are real skills and real traditions, and they deserve the recognition they receive. But the invisible work is also real. The expertise that never becomes a spectacle is still expertise. The professionalism that operates without applause is still professionalism. And there is an argument to be made that it is, in some ways, the harder kind to sustain. Because doing excellent work in front of an audience that is watching you carries its own reward. The crowd's attention is itself a form of acknowledgement. But doing excellent work in the full knowledge that if you do it correctly nobody will ever know you did it at all, that requires a different kind of commitment, a quieter kind of pride, a relationship with your own standards that does not depend on anyone else confirming them. David Holt knew. He gave the nod, which contained everything that needed to be said between two professionals who understood the same language. The yard supervisor knew, in the way that the person responsible for the whole operation always carries a private knowledge of what almost happened and did not. The stable hand at the tack room door knew, in the partial way that the people adjacent to expertise always have a sense of what they witnessed without necessarily being able to fully name it. But the crowd on the pavement did not know, and the tourists near the gate did not know, even though they had been standing 20 feet from the event. And the woman in the yellow jacket, who had watched the whole thing and developed 3 consecutive incorrect theories about what she was seeing, walked away from the Royal Mews that morning with the memory of a beautiful departure and the feeling that everything had gone perfectly, which was completely accurate and also missed almost everything. Now the question this moment leaves behind is one worth actually considering. Not just for royal occasions, and not just for ceremonial events, but for every polished, seemingly effortless performance you have ever watched and simply accepted as something that just happens naturally. What were the 8 minutes that you never saw? Who was the person with the canvas bag? What did they fix before the gates opened, before the music started, before the lights came up? What is happening right now, in some back room or staging yard or preparation space, that will never appear in any photograph of the finished moment, but without which the finished moment would simply not exist? Because here is the thing about the invisible workers behind every spectacle. They are not invisible because they are unimportant. They are invisible because they are so good at what they do that their work disappears into the very perfection it creates. And recognizing that, actually pausing to consider it, changes something about the way a procession looks as it passes by. The next time you watch something that looks completely effortless, something that moves with the kind of ease that seems almost too good to be real, perhaps the honest response is not just admiration for what you can see. Perhaps it is a moment of quiet acknowledgement for everything you cannot. Thomas Aldridge closed his tool bag, walked back to his workbench, and began laying out equipment for the afternoon's routine shoeing schedule. Outside, the procession was moving through London. The crowds were cheering. The horses were perfect. The morning had gone without a hitch. Exactly as planned. Have you ever been standing in a crowd watching something beautiful and found yourself wondering what happened in the hour before it? Leave your story below. And if you have ever worked one of those invisible jobs, the ones where doing it right means nobody knows you were there, tell us what that feels like. Because those stories deserve to be heard too.